40 years ago, folks here in Harlan County figured Ezra Combs had died of grief. But he wasn't gone. He built a cabin with 3 windows, planted 3 gardens, one for each of them, and talked to their pictures.
How he vanished for 40 years into Appalachia, after killing every man who burned his family alive. They found the cabin in 1997, hidden so deep in the mountains of Pike County that the hikers who discovered it believed they had stumbled upon ruins from another century. But the man inside was not a relic. He was 78 years old, had been living alone in the wilderness for exactly 4 decades, and had killed 23 men before retreating into terrain that had swallowed him as completely as fire had swallowed his family. This is the true story of the longest disappearance in Kentucky criminal history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Pike County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields. During the violent years of the late 1950s, when the coal companies ruled with authority that no government could challenge. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the nation's founding, who understood that justice was something you created yourself because no court would create it for you. You see, in Pike County during the years of our story, the coal that lay beneath a family's land had become more valuable than the family itself. Companies that wanted that coal had developed methods for obtaining it that legitimate commerce would never have sanctioned, methods that included violence, corruption, and the kind of terror that courts refused to acknowledge and newspapers declined to report. The man at the center of our story was born Solomon Ezekiel Combs in 1919, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where his family had lived since 1793. He had inherited land that his ancestors had claimed when Kentucky was still Virginia's western territory, had maintained it through generations of Combs stewardship that had never bent to any outside authority. He was 38 years old in the autumn of 1957, a man whose quiet determination had preserved his family through every challenge that the mountains had presented. That's right. Solomon Combs stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, had dark hair that was just beginning to show streaks of gray, possessed eyes that were the pale blue of winter ice, and that seemed to hold depths that casual observation could not penetrate. His body was lean and hard from 4 decades of mountain labor. His hands were calloused from work that had shaped him since childhood. His movements carried an efficiency that suggested capabilities most people would never have suspected. He had served in the war, had fought across Europe from Normandy to the heart of Germany, had survived experiences that had killed men around him with regularity that should have been impossible to endure. He had returned to the mountains with skills and knowledge that peacetime did not require him to use, but the skills remained, waiting for circumstances that would justify their application. His family was everything to him. His wife Ruth was 35 years old, a woman whose beauty had not diminished despite 15 years of mountain labor, whose love for her husband and children formed the foundation of everything the family had built. Their children were the continuation of everything Solomon's ancestors had worked for. Jacob was 14, already showing signs of becoming the man his father hoped he would be. Mary was 11, with her mother's dark hair and her father's determined spirit. Samuel was 8, curious about everything and afraid of nothing. And little Hannah was just 5 years old, the baby of the family, whose laughter could fill the hollow on quiet summer evenings. The trouble that would destroy this family began with coal seams that ran beneath the Combs property, coal that a company called Consolidated Mining had determined to extract regardless of what the surface owners might prefer. The company had made offers that Solomon had refused, had applied pressure that he had resisted, had finally determined that resistance would be broken through methods that legitimate commerce would never have sanctioned. The sheriff of Pike County was a man named Vernon Crawford, whose position had been purchased by the mining companies specifically to address problems like Solomon Combs. Crawford had developed a reputation for methods that exceeded what civilized enforcement would permit, had broken other families through violence that courts refused to examine. Crawford assembled a force of 23 deputies whose loyalty was to the company rather than the law, whose badges provided cover for actions that badges should never have sanctioned. He had received orders from Consolidated Mining: eliminate the Combs family, demonstrate what happened to those who refused to surrender land that the company had determined to take. The raid came on the night of October 15th, 1957. Solomon was not home when the deputies arrived. He had traveled to Pikeville 3 days before to file legal papers that might have protected his property, documents that the company's influence would ensure never reached a judge. The timing of the raid had been calculated to ensure his absence, to prevent complications that a combat veteran might have created. Ruth met the deputies at the door of the cabin that had been her home for 15 years, met them with the children gathered behind her, met them with a rifle in her hands, and the determination in her eyes that had made Solomon love her since they were both young. "My husband isn't here," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the fear that her heart must have contained. "Whatever business you have is with him. Come back when he returns." Crawford stepped forward with a smile that contained no warmth, only the satisfaction of a man who held absolute power over those before him. "Our business is with this property, Mrs. Combs. Your husband has refused every reasonable offer. The company has decided that this resistance ends tonight." "You have no authority here," Ruth replied, raising the rifle to a position that showed she knew how to use it. "This is Combs' land. My husband's family has held it for over 160 years. You will leave." Crawford's smile widened. "One woman and 4 children against 23 armed men. The mathematics don't favor you. Mrs. Combs, I suggest you lower that rifle and step outside. This will be easier for everyone if you cooperate." What happened next would be reconstructed only from evidence that the scene provided and from testimony that Solomon would give 40 years later. Ruth did not cooperate. Ruth fired, struck a deputy who had been moving toward Jacob with intent that maternal instinct had recognized. The deputy fell, and the world changed forever. The other deputies opened fire immediately, a volley that shattered windows and splintered wood and drove Ruth backward into the cabin she was trying to protect. She returned fire as best she could, positioned herself between the attackers and her children, fought with the ferocity of a mother defending what she loved most. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes. Ruth was struck multiple times, fell in the doorway she had been defending, died reaching toward children she could no longer protect. The children screamed, ran toward the back of the cabin, sought escape through a door that deputies had already blocked. They were captured in the yard behind the cabin, 4 children whose ages ranged from 14 to 5, whose crime was being borne to parents who refused to sell land that a company had decided to take. They were held while Crawford made decisions about what would happen next. "We can't leave witnesses," Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the yard where the children struggled against hands that held them. "The woman killed Mitchell. Her children saw everything. This ends tonight completely." What Crawford ordered next exceeded what any of his deputies had anticipated. Some refused, walked away from the scene, would not participate in what was about to occur. Those who remained, and enough remained, followed orders that should never have been given. They forced the children back into the cabin, forced them into the building where their mother's body still lay, locked the door from outside with timber that prevented any possibility of escape. The children screamed as they were pushed inside, screamed as they saw their mother's body in the doorway, screamed as they heard the sound of timber being placed against doors that would not open again. Jacob, at 14 the oldest, tried to take charge as his father would have wanted. He gathered his siblings away from their mother's body, led them toward the back of the cabin, tried to find an exit that might not be guarded. But every window showed firelight already. Every door rattled against timber that held it closed from outside. "Stay together," Jacob said, his voice shaking but determined. "We stay together. Daddy will come, he'll find us." Then they applied torches to walls that the autumn had made dry, set fire to a cabin that contained 4 children whose screams would carry across the hollow until smoke and flame silenced them forever. The fire caught the eastern wall first, spread with a hunger that the dry wood could not resist. Within minutes, the flames had climbed to the roof, had begun to consume the structure from the outside in. The heat inside the cabin rose rapidly, became uncomfortable, became painful, became unbearable. The children did not die quickly. Jacob tried everything a 14-year-old could try, everything his father had taught him about survival and determination. He soaked blankets in water from the kitchen basin, wrapped his siblings in the wet fabric, tried to protect them from heat that the blankets could not stop. He broke a window with his fist, felt the glass tear his skin, felt the rush of air that the fire immediately consumed. The flames surged toward the oxygen his efforts had provided, cut off the exit before anyone could climb through. The fire was alive, was hungry, was feeding on the cabin and reaching for the children inside. "Hannah, I'm going to lift you through," Jacob shouted, picking up his 5-year-old sister despite flames that licked at the window frame. "You're small enough. You can fit." But the fire was faster than Jacob's determination. The window frame ignited as he lifted Hannah toward it, forced him back, forced him to shield his baby sister from flames that had been inches from her face. Hannah screamed, a sound that was half terror and half pain, a sound that would echo in the memories of everyone who heard it for 40 years. Mary, at 11, tried to be brave the way her mother had been brave. She held Samuel's hand with a grip that fear made too tight, pulled him toward corners of the cabin that the fire had not yet reached. She was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to know that they might not survive, young enough to still believe that somehow her father would save them. "It's okay, Sammy," Mary said to her 8-year-old brother, speaking words that she needed to hear as much as he did. "Daddy will come. Daddy always comes when we need him. We just have to wait. We just have to be brave." Samuel cried, tears streaming down cheeks that the heat was already reddening. He was 8 years old enough to be afraid, young enough to believe his sister when she said their father would save them. He gripped Mary's hand and would not let go, would hold that grip until the end, would die the way he had lived, connected to the sister who had always protected him. Hannah stood in the center of what had become an inferno, her small body frozen with terror that exceeded what her 5-year-old mind could process. She had stopped screaming, her voice had given out, had been stolen by smoke that was filling her lungs. She reached toward the doorway where her mother's body lay, reached toward the only source of comfort she knew, reached toward someone who could no longer provide the protection she needed. "Mama," she whispered, the word barely audible above the roar of flames. "Mama, wake up. I'm scared. Mama, please wake up. Please make it stop." The screaming lasted approximately 7 minutes. The neighbors who heard it from distant ridges would testify to that duration 40 years later, would describe sounds that had haunted their dreams for 4 decades, sounds that no amount of time could erase from memory. 7 minutes of children calling for help that could not come, calling for parents who could not answer, calling for a God who did not intervene. Jacob screamed for his father until the smoke stole his voice. Mary screamed for someone to save Samuel until her lungs could no longer draw air. Samuel screamed for his mother and father until consciousness left him. And Hannah, little Hannah who had just turned 5, cried "Mama," until the word became silence and the silence became the end of everything. The fire consumed the cabin completely, reduced timber that had stood since 1847 to ash that the morning wind would scatter. It burned for nearly an hour after the screaming stopped, burned until nothing remained except embers and bone and the smell of death that would linger in the hollow for weeks. Ruth's body was found in the doorway the following morning, found by Solomon when he returned from Pikeville to discover that everything he had built had been reduced to ash and bone. The children's remains were found in the back room where they had made their final stand against flames that no courage could have defeated. Solomon walked through the ruins for hours, identifying what remained of each child by location and by fragments that the fire had not completely consumed. He found Jacob near the window, found evidence of the attempt to help Hannah escape. He found Mary and Samuel together, found bones that suggested they had been holding hands when death finally claimed them. He found Hannah in the corner, found the smallest skeleton in a position that suggested she had been crying for her mother until the end. He gathered what remained of each of them, ash and bone that had been his family, and placed them in containers that he found in the root cellar, the only structure the fire had not consumed. He spent the entire day at this task, worked without speaking, worked without weeping, worked with a methodical precision that suggested a mind that had moved beyond grief into something else entirely. That evening, as darkness fell over ruins that still smelled of smoke and death, Solomon Combs buried his family on a ridge overlooking the hollow where Combs families had lived for over 160 years. He dug 5 graves with his own hands, placed his wife and children in earth that his ancestors had made sacred, spoke words over each burial, that combined prayer with promise. "I'm going to kill every man who did this," he said over the final grave, Hannah's grave, the smallest mound on a ridge that now held 5. Every man who carried a torch, every man who locked that door, every man who stood watching while my children burned. They will all die, Ruth. They will all die understanding what they did. This I swear on the graves of our babies. This I promise on whatever remains of my soul. The transformation that occurred within Solomon during the days following the burials was absolute. The husband and father who had spent 38 years building a life ceased to exist. In his place emerged something older and colder, something that drew on knowledge the war had taught him, something that would not rest until 23 men had experienced what his family had experienced. He learned that some deputies had refused to participate in the burning, had walked away before torches were applied. Those men he would spare, not from mercy but from precision. He would kill only those who had participated directly, only those whose hands had been part of what destroyed his family. He identified 18 deputies who had remained, who had locked the door or applied the torches or stood watching while children screamed. 18, plus Crawford, plus 4 others who had been present and had not walked away. 23 in all. The campaign began on November 15, 1957, exactly 1 month after the night his family had burned. The method he chose reflected the deaths his family had suffered. Fire, always fire, administered in ways that ensured his victims understood exactly why they were dying. The first deputy died in his own home, a structure that Solomon had watched for 3 nights, learning its vulnerabilities, identifying the paths that fire would take. He blocked the exits with timber he had prepared in the forest, sealed windows with boards he had cut to size. He poured kerosene along paths that would ensure the fire spread faster than any escape attempt could outrun. The match he struck seemed almost ceremonial, a ritual that began the justice he had promised Ruth over their children's graves. The fire caught with enthusiasm that the kerosene provided, spread along the paths he had prepared, climbed the walls with hunger that matched what he had seen consume his own cabin. The deputy woke to smoke and heat, woke to discover that his exits were blocked, woke to understand that he was experiencing what 4 children had experienced 1 month before. His screams carried through the night, carried for approximately 12 minutes before the flames silenced them. Solomon timed every second, documented the duration, compared it to the 7 minutes his children had burned. 12 minutes was longer than 7. The deputy had suffered more than the children had. But it was not enough, could never be enough, to balance the scales that the crime had unbalanced. The structure burned for 23 minutes before collapsing. Solomon timed it, documented it, noted that his family had burned for only 7. He would need to adjust future fires to ensure they lasted longer, to ensure the suffering was proportionate to what his children had experienced. The message left at the scene read, "For the Combs children, 1 of 23. The terror that spread through Pike County was unlike anything the region had experienced since the blood feuds of the previous century. Deputies who had participated in the burning understood immediately that they were being hunted, that the father whose children they had burned alive was coming for them with patience and skill that their numbers could not counter. The second deputy died 3 days later, in a fire that lasted longer than the first because Solomon had refined his methods. He used multiple ignition points, created conditions that ensured the fire would burn hotter and longer, that ensured escape would be impossible and suffering would be extended. The deputy screamed for nearly 15 minutes before the flames took him. Solomon counted every second, documented every sound, compared the duration to what his children had endured. 15 minutes was better than 12. But it still wasn't 7 minutes times 4 children. It still wasn't enough. The third and fourth deputies died within a week of the second, taken from locations they believed were secure, burned in structures they believed were safe. Solomon developed techniques that used the terrain itself against his victims, that trapped them in buildings, that became furnaces before they could understand what was happening. That's right. Solomon killed the deputies using the same method they had used on his family, ensured that each experienced flames that matched what his children had experienced. Each victim died in fire, died screaming, died with the terror that 4 children had felt, while their father was miles away unable to help them. The 5th through 10th deputies died during December, taken despite precautions that their fear had demanded. Solomon developed techniques that prevented escape, that trapped his victims in structures that became furnaces, that ensured the burning lasted long enough for true understanding to occur. Some fires lasted 15 minutes, others lasted 20. None lasted less than 7, the duration his children had burned. Crawford attempted to flee on January 5, 1958, arranged transportation that he believed was secret, planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky and the vengeance that had claimed 10 of his men. Solomon was waiting where the route required Crawford's vehicle to slow, had tracked the sheriff's preparations with surveillance that flight could not escape. "Do you remember my children?" Solomon asked after Crawford's vehicle had been disabled, after the sheriff had been dragged from his car into forest that would witness his final hours. Jacob was 14. He tried to save his sister. Mary was 11. She held Samuel's hand while they burned. Samuel was 8. Hannah was 5. She cried for her mother until the smoke took her voice. "Do you remember them, Crawford?" Crawford tried to speak, tried to offer explanations that might delay what was clearly coming. He blamed the company, claimed he had been following orders, insisted that the burning had not been his idea. "You gave the order," Solomon replied. "You said, 'We can't leave witnesses.' You watched while your men locked that door. You stood in the yard while my children screamed for 7 minutes. You waited until the screaming stopped before you left." What Solomon did to Vernon Crawford during the hours that followed would be detailed in testimony given 40 years later. Crawford did not die quickly. Quick deaths did not satisfy the requirements of justice that Solomon had determined to impose. Crawford died in fire that was administered in stages, that was allowed to consume portions of his body while he remained conscious, that extended across hours that felt like eternities. "My children burned for 7 minutes, Solomon told Crawford during the process. "You're going to burn for much longer than that. You're going to understand what 7 minutes feels like when you're 5 years old and you're crying for your mother, and the fire is everywhere, and there's nowhere to escape." Crawford's death marked the 11th, but 12 remained. They had fled in different directions, had hidden in locations across 4 states, had changed names and appearances in desperate attempts to escape vengeance that had proven inescapable. Solomon tracked them anyway, found them regardless of what precautions they employed, introduced each to fire that they had thought they could escape by running. The 12th through 15th deputies died in January. The 16th through 19th died in February. The 20th through 22nd died in March, taken from locations in Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. The 23rd deputy died on April 15, 1958, exactly 6 months after the night Solomon's family had burned. The final deputy had fled to Indiana, had built a new life under a new name, had married a woman who knew nothing about his past. Solomon found him anyway, appeared in a town the deputy had believed was beyond any hunter's reach, waited until the moment when justice could be administered without harming anyone who had not participated in the crime. The death matched all the others. Fire, screaming, a message that documented the count for the Combs children, 23 of 23, justice complete. 23 men killed over 6 months by a man who used their own method against them, who ensured that each experienced what his children had experienced, who demonstrated that fire was a weapon that could be wielded by anyone with sufficient love and sufficient determination. And then Solomon Combs vanished. He disappeared into the deepest mountains of Pike County, into terrain so remote that no trail approached it and no map documented it. His family had known about this location for generations, had maintained it as refuge against times when refuge might become necessary. Solomon's father had shown him the entrance when he was 12 years old, had explained that the location was insurance against futures that could not be predicted. That future had arrived, and Solomon had used what his father had taught him. The location was not a hollow or a cave, but a combination of both. A narrow valley surrounded by ridges so steep that approach was possible only through a single passage that appeared impassable to anyone who had not been shown its secrets. The valley was approximately 1 mile long and a 1/4 mile wide, contained water that flowed year-round, supported game that sustained a man through seasons that asked nothing from the outside world. He built a cabin against the valley's southern wall, constructed it from timber the location provided, created a structure that would serve him for the next 4 decades. The construction gave purpose to hands that grief might otherwise have made idle, gave direction to a mind that completed vengeance might otherwise have left without aim. The cabin was small, approximately 16 feet by 16 feet, but it was built with care that exceeded what survival alone would have required. He built it for his family as much as for himself, created spaces that would hold their memories, that would serve as the home they would share until death reunited them. He constructed a shelf along one wall specifically to hold the 5 containers that held his family's remains. He positioned them in order, Ruth first, then Jacob, then Mary, then Samuel, then Hannah. Arranged them as they had been arranged around the dinner table, as they had been arranged in life. The shelf faced the single window so that morning light would illuminate them each day, so that his first sight upon waking would always be what remained of the people he had loved. He brought what remained of his family with him, the containers that held their ashes, the few possessions that the fire had not consumed, the photographs that the root cellar had preserved. The photographs became treasures beyond price, images that showed faces he would never see again except in memory and in dreams. He framed them with wood he carved himself, hung them where he could see them from any position in the cabin. He created a memorial inside his cabin. A corner he called their space is where he gathered everything that connected to them. Ruth's hairbrush that she had kept in the root cellar, Jacob's pocket knife that had been in his school bag, away from the house that night, Mary's ribbon that had fallen in the yard during the struggle, Samuel's carved horse that Solomon had made for his birthday 2 years before, Hannah's rag doll that had been drying on the line outside and that the fire had not reached. He arranged these items with reverence that exceeded what any church could have demanded, dusted them daily, spoke to them as if the objects could hear him, maintained connections to people who existed now only in his memory and in the containers on the shelf. He spoke to them daily, maintained conversations with the dead that structured his existence through decades of solitude. The conversations followed routines that the years refined, but never fundamentally changed. "Good morning, Ruth," he would say each day upon waking, looking first at her container on the shelf. "Good morning, children. How did everyone sleep? I dreamed about that picnic we had by the creek, the one where Samuel caught that tiny fish and was so proud of it. Remember that, Samuel. You wanted to keep it as a pet. Your mother said we couldn't, but she let you draw a picture of it instead." He would describe his plans for the day, address each family member in turn, ask their opinions about decisions that survival required. "Jacob, I'm thinking of setting traps on the North Ridge today. You always had good instincts about where the rabbits ran. What do you think?" "That's a good point, son. The South Ridge did produce better last autumn. I'll try both and see which serves us better." He would tell Mary about the wildflowers that bloomed briefly each spring, would describe colors that seemed impossibly vivid against the browns and greens that dominated the valley. He would tell Samuel about the deer he had seen, about the fish in the stream, about the adventures they could have had together in this hidden place. He would sing to Hannah the lullabies he had sung when she was alive, would describe the stars that she had loved to watch, would tell her that she would always be his baby, his sunshine, his little light. "I killed them all, Ruth," he told her ashes during one of these conversations, months into his isolation. "Every man who was there that night. They all died in fire. They all understood why they were dying before the flames took them. Crawford died the worst. I made sure of that. Justice is complete. Now I live up here with you and the children until my time comes. Now I wait until I can see you all again." He developed systems for survival that the decades refined and improved. He established gardens in the sunniest portion of the valley, grew potatoes and beans and squash, and the tomatoes that Ruth had always loved. He tended the gardens with care that exceeded what mere sustenance required, grew vegetables as offerings to a family that could no longer eat them. He hunted deer and turkey, and smaller game that populated the valley in abundance that his presence did not diminish. He learned the patterns of animals that shared his territory, developed techniques for taking them that provided the protein his body required. He smoked and dried meat through the warm months, accumulated stores that sustained him through winters when hunting became difficult. The first years were consumed by grief that the vengeance had delayed but not eliminated. The fury that had sustained him through 6 months of killing faded when the last deputy died, was replaced by pain that he had not allowed himself to feel while justice remained incomplete. Now, with the killing done and nothing remaining to distract him, he mourned a wife and children whose ashes rested on the shelf beside his bed. He came close to ending his own life during those early years, came close to joining his family in whatever existence awaited beyond death. The rifle that he kept for hunting could have ended everything, could have reunited him with the wife and children, whose absence made continuation seem pointless. But something always stopped him. Perhaps it was Ruth's voice in his memory, telling him that Combs' men didn't surrender. Perhaps it was Jacob, reminding him that someone needed to tend the family's memory. Perhaps it was Hannah, asking her daddy to stay a little longer to keep her company a little more. "Not yet," he would tell them when the impulse grew strong. "Not yet. You need me to remember you. You need me to keep you company. If I go now, who will talk to you? Who will tell you about the seasons changing? Who will sing Hannah her lullabies? I'll come when it's time. But not yet. Not yet." The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. He marked time by events that mattered, the anniversary of the fire, birthdays that his children would have celebrated, Christmas mornings when he would describe to Hannah the presents she might have received, the joy she might have felt. He kept journals throughout his isolation, documented his days and thoughts in notebooks he made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals contained conversations with his family that he recorded as if they were actually responding, as if death had not created silence that only his imagination could fill. "Ruth says the garden looks good this year," he wrote in an entry from 1975, 18 years into his isolation. "She says the tomatoes remind her of the ones we used to grow before the fire. Jacob helped me plan where to plant the beans. He always was good at figuring out where the sun hit best. Mary gathered wildflowers for Hannah's corner of the cabin. Samuel found a deer trail that might be good for hunting come autumn. We're all together up here, different than before, but together." He wrote about the fire constantly, about the night that had ended everything, about the screaming that he had not been present to hear, but that his imagination had recreated in detail that tormented his sleep for decades. "I dream about them sometimes," he wrote in an entry from 1980. "I dream I'm there, but I can't reach them. The fire is between us, and I can see them through the flames, and they're calling for me, and I can't get to them." Jacob is holding Hannah, trying to lift her through the window. Mary and Samuel are holding hands. Ruth is already gone, lying in the doorway. I wake up reaching for them. They're not there. They haven't been there for 23 years. But the containers are there, beside my bed. I hold them sometimes until morning comes. It's all I have left of them. The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. Solomon watched the world change from vantage points that his hidden valley provided. He saw aircraft become more common in skies that had been empty when his isolation began. He heard sounds of civilization that the growing population produced. He observed a world moving forward, while he remained anchored to a night in October when everything that mattered had been taken from him in flames. By the mid-1990s, Solomon was in his late 70s, had survived alone in the wilderness for nearly 4 decades, had maintained his existence through determination that most people would have found impossible. His body was failing in ways that decades of mountain living had delayed but could not prevent. His hands trembled with age that no determination could defeat. His eyes, once as sharp as any hunter's, required light that the dimness of his cabin could not always provide. He knew that his time was ending. He prepared for death with the same methodical precision he had applied to everything else, ensured that his journals would survive him, that the truth he had preserved would eventually reach the world. Solomon Combs was found on October 15, 1997, exactly 40 years after the night his family had burned. He was found not because he had died, but because hikers had stumbled upon his valley, had discovered his cabin, had encountered a man whose existence they could not explain. He was 78 years old, weathered by 40 years of wilderness living, barely recognizable as the man whose photograph had hung in cold case files for 4 decades. He did not resist when the hikers reported their discovery. He did not flee when authorities arrived. He simply waited, as he had waited for 40 years, for the moment when his story would finally be told. "My name is Solomon Combs," he told the deputies who came to investigate. "In October of 1957, Vernon Crawford and 23 deputies burned my family alive in our cabin while I was away. My wife Ruth, my children Jacob, Mary, Samuel, and Hannah. They burned for 7 minutes while the deputies watched. I killed every man who participated. I've been living up here ever since, waiting to die, waiting to see my family again." He was carrying the containers that held his family's ashes, had not been separated from them for 40 years. He presented them to authorities as evidence, as explanation, as justification for everything he had done. "This is my wife," he said, holding each container in turn. "This is Jacob. This is Mary. This is Samuel. This is Hannah." She was 5 years old. She cried for her mother until the smoke took her voice. "I've been talking to them every day for 40 years. I've been keeping them company until I could join them." The confession that followed was the most detailed in Kentucky criminal history. Solomon described the burning of his cabin with grief that 40 years had not diminished, described the killing of 23 deputies with precision that memory had not eroded. He led investigators to evidence that confirmed his account, the valley where he had lived, the journals that documented everything, the locations where the deputies had died. He was not prosecuted. The statute of limitations had expired decades before. All witnesses were dead. And the defendant was 78 years old with health that years of isolation had compromised beyond repair. The prosecutor who reviewed the case concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose except to punish a man who had already served 40 years of self-imposed exile in conditions that exceeded what any prison could provide. Investigators who examined historical records discovered evidence that supported Solomon's account. Documents were found that confirmed Consolidated Mining's involvement, that confirmed Crawford had been paid to eliminate families that resisted the company's expansion, that confirmed the burning had been ordered rather than spontaneous. The crime that had begun everything was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. Solomon died on December 25, 1997, Christmas morning, 2 months after his discovery. He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by the containers that held his family's ashes, speaking words to Ruth and the children that only he could hear. His final words were spoken to a nurse who was checking his vitals. "They're here. Ruth and the children. They came for me. Jacob's gotten so tall, Mary's wearing the dress she wore for her birthday. Samuel's asking if we can go hunting when I'm better. And Hannah. Hannah's laughing. She's not crying anymore, she's laughing. She says it's warm where they are. She says there's no fire. She says Christmas is beautiful there." Solomon was buried beside Ruth and Jacob and Mary and Samuel and Hannah in graves that had waited 40 years for the family to be complete. His ashes were placed with theirs, mingled as families should be mingled, together at last in earth that would hold them forever. The inscription on the stone that marks all 6 graves reads, "The Combs family, Ruth, Jacob, Mary, Samuel, Hannah, burned October 15, 1957. Solomon, reunited December 25, 1997. Together at last. The fire separated them for 40 years. Nothing separates them now." The songs that emerged from Solomon's story were among the most mournful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of children burned alive and the devotion of a father who spent 40 years talking to their ashes. The first verse described the family before the fire, the wife and 4 children who filled the hollow with laughter, the life that should have continued for generations. The melody was warm despite its subject, suggesting happiness that should have been protected. The second verse described the burning, the 7 minutes of screaming that carried across the hollow, the children calling for a father who was too far away to hear. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying heat that seemed to burn the music itself. The third verse described Solomon's return, the ashes he gathered from ruins that had been his home, the promises he made over graves he dug with his own hands. The melody grew quiet and purposeful, suggesting determination that nothing could extinguish. The fourth verse described the vengeance, 23 deputies dying in flames that matched what they had created, Crawford dying longest because his orders had begun everything. The melody grew fierce and unrelenting, suggesting justice that no badge could prevent. The fifth verse described the 40 years, a man alone in a hidden valley, speaking daily to ashes that could not respond, keeping his family company until death could reunite them. The melody softened, became almost tender, suggesting love that time could not diminish. The final verse described the discovery and the reunion, a father dying on Christmas morning, with his children's laughter in his ears, joining a family that had waited 40 years for completion. The melody resolved into something approaching joy, suggesting that some separations are only temporary, no matter how long they last. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the stone where the Combs family rests together after 40 years of separation? To read the inscription that speaks of burning and waiting and eternal reunion? Would you try to understand how love could sustain a life through 40 years of solitude? How a father could speak daily to ashes that held what remained of his children? The journey to the hidden valley is difficult. Solomon chose it for remoteness that would prevent discovery. But some make the pilgrimage anyway. They come to see the cabin where he survived, to understand what it means to love so completely that 40 years of isolation is merely the space between fire and family reunion. And that, my friend, is the true story of how Solomon Combs vanished for 40 years into Appalachia after killing every man who burned his family alive. A story of love that death could not end, of devotion that time could not diminish, of a father who spent 40 years keeping his children company until Christmas morning brought him home to them forever. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Solomon Combs killed 23 deputies who had burned his wife and 4 children alive, then disappeared into the deepest mountains of Pike County for 40 years, carrying their ashes with him, speaking to them daily until hikers discovered him, and he died 2 months later on Christmas morning with his children's laughter in his ears. What about you? If deputies burned your wife and 4 children alive while you were away, could you kill 23 men using the same method they had used on your family? Could you carry their ashes into the mountains for 40 years, speaking to them daily, keeping them company until death reunited you on Christmas morning? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, holding their secrets and their dead. And some fathers love their families so completely that 40 years of solitude is merely the space between burning and forever. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the fathers who call them home.